On this episode of Made in America, I'm with Commissioner David Lehman from the Department of Economic and Community Development, and we're covering some great topics, including his view on manufacturing in the state, as well as the 4 pillars that are key to economic success in the future. It's a great episode. Don't go anywhere. Hey, it's Ari Santiago. Welcome to this episode of Made in America. I have a really exciting guest on today. I'm with David Lehman, the Commissioner of the Department of Economic and Community Development. It's a mouthful. Really excited to have David on. I think it's going to be super interesting to hear not only of somebody who's going to play a pivotal role in helping shape economic development in Connecticut in the years to come, but also somebody with a private sector background who kind of brings a unique and different experience to the table that I think is going to be great to hear about for all of manufacturers in the audience. So David, thank you so much for coming on today. Really appreciate it.
No, it's great to be here, Ari. Thanks for having me.
So listen, it's Made in America podcast. So we start off with the same 2 questions. What do you make and why do you make it?
Absolutely. So DECD, for those that aren't familiar with it, is responsible. It's the Department of Economic and Community Development. So it has oversight for a number of different things as it relates to the state. Certainly business retention and recruitment, first and foremost, very, very important to the state of Connecticut. But also there's tourism, brownfields, culture, arts, so broad oversight of, what drives the state's economy from business to arts and museums. So it's it's roughly 100 folks based here in Hartford. And that's what we do, really work with the private sector across the state to help really advance the state's economy.
So let's get a little bit into the why you kind of got involved with this. For people that don't know, and I know it's been pretty well reported, you were executive at Goldman Sachs. I would assume doing pretty well in your career. As we also discussed, you're a very young guy, being born the same year as me. We're both very young.
Young for middle age.
That's right. Yeah, young for middle age. So what made you what's the why that drove you to say, I want to get involved with DECD? That's
a great question. So I've been a resident for 10 years. My wife is from Westport. We have two kids and raising a family here in the state of Connecticut. The more I learned about Governor Lamont really after his election and what he wanted to do, his style, how results-oriented, pragmatic he is, the fact that he's the first businessman in 30 years to run the state, it really struck me in a way, almost similar to Mike Bloomberg when he became mayor of New York City in the early 2000s. Lamont reminded me a lot of Mike Bloomberg in that way. So I reached out. I didn't know Governor Lamont, and I felt like if I could be useful at a point when the state, I thought, the past 10 years in terms of the state's economy, migration, some of the fiscal issues that we're dealing with, I felt like if I could be useful, I wanted to for a governor who I thought could have a real impact. So I reached out to the Lamont campaign in January, or Lamont administration, I should say, in January, and said, here's my resume. If I can be useful, I'm happy to leave my day job and work with you guys. Had a number of conversations, meetings. They ended up taking me up on the offer. I actually didn't know what DECD was when I first reached out. And here I am 9 months later.
So when you reached out, DECD wasn't the thing you reached out for. You just sort of said, hey, listen, I got some experience here. I love Connecticut. I want to make it a better place. What can I do to help?
That's right. I didn't know what DECD was. So I didn't reach out with a job in mind. I said, here's my resume. I had been at Goldman Sachs for 15 years, have experience in real estate, municipal finance, financial markets, and a number of different things. And I said, if I can be helpful to you as it relates to the economy, advisor, there's obviously this commissioner role right now, I'll do it. So I just wanted to be useful in a way if it helped the Lamont administration.
So I know as your role kind of DECD, the DECD commissioner role comes with a pretty hefty annual salary that you've decided to decline. Why'd you make that decision?
I just thought it was the right thing, candidly. I mean, my motivation to be here was to be helpful to Lamont and help fix and further the state's economy. So this was not a motivation that was determined by money or driven by money at all. So I just wanted to kind of get that out in the open, said I'm willing to do this, and it's not about the money. So if it's foregoing the money is what makes sense, then I'm happy to do that.
Sure. Hey, listen, every dollar we can put back into investing in economic development is going to be helpful along the way.
Yeah.
Exactly. So as you've met with the governor, well, actually, let me ask that question. How often do you meet with the governor? Like kind of what's your access and and what's his priority on what you're doing?
I would say we have a regular dialogue, and that's phone calls and meetings, typically daily, but if not daily, multiple times a week. And I think it's really important. And some of that is Governor Lamont's style. He's very collaborative. He's a convener. He wants to work kind of with everyone to further the state. So we have a very, very regular dialogue. And I think I'm very impressed by, the governor and how he conducts business.
In terms of the Lamont administration, I don't know how much you want to speak for the whole administration, but where does economic development, in your view, rank in the list of priorities that the administration and that the governor's laid out, and what you're seeing in terms of the action that comes from that?
Yeah, it's a top priority. I mean, if you look at and obviously I can't speak for the governor, but from my perspective, the state's economy, job growth, income growth, output growth, all of that's really important. And if you look over the past 10 years, we have not performed as well as we should be performing. So, the governor here, as I mentioned before, first businessman in 30 years to really run the state. So his perspective on fiscal stability, on transportation, on workforce, it's unique. And his also really importantly, Ari, he really reaches out to business. I mean, not a week goes by that we don't have several meetings, whether they're visits to business, whether it's in the Capitol, we convene CEO forums, we've done dinners. So it's really important that we have a very good relationship with business to understand what's working and what's not working. So it is a top priority. Yeah,
that's really, that's exciting. And listen, I mean, we kind of first connected because you sent me a very nice handwritten congratulatory note for IT Direct, my company's kind of presence on the, Inc. 5000 growing list in Connecticut, which was, thank you again, really very well received by me. And I think, you said it was all right for me to kind of post that on social media, which I did. And I was telling you before that got tremendous amount of engagement and a lot of people saying that, everything starts with a change in perception. And I think perception starts with a change in behavior. And that kind of, those simple things, a little handwritten note, fabulous on that. You put your business card in there and kind of, true to kind of the next generation looking forward, your cell phone's on there. I was like, let me see how this works. Shoot you a text, you text me back. I think that level of engagement, speaking on behalf of myself and other businesses in Connecticut, especially on the manufacturing side, seeing a level of engagement from state government is really going to be helpful, I think.
Yeah. Well, first off, I appreciate you saying that. And the punchline is we care. I mean, we want, government needs to be accessible, responsive. I think from our perspective, and the reason I decided to write those notes to all the businesses on the Inc. 5000 list, I think there was around 35 or 40 of them, is, we want to have, the Lamont administration wants to have, we need to have a great relationship with business, with CEOs, to make it, business is hard and ultimately, clients, competitors, there's a lot of pressure making sure you have the right people. Government should be there to be helpful where we can, and we can talk more about what that means. But ultimately, I want to make sure that business feels really welcome here, and that if there are issues, if there are places where the government can help, that you don't hesitate to reach out, whether that's to my cell phone at 8 o'clock at night or to my office or my email. That's welcome.
That's fantastic. So let me actually kind of pull on that thread a little bit before we get into the strategy itself. One of the things that's certainly not escaped the notice of manufacturing leaders in Connecticut and myself as well is the number of private sector people. I mean, obviously Governor Lamont himself came out of the private sector, yourself, and there's others as well that have really kind of joined the administration. And I'm curious from the business development perspective and economic growth, how do you think that's going to lead to positive outcomes?
It's a great question. So, I mean, the governor's very big on public-private partnerships, and that is probably an overused term. That could mean many different things. But as it relates to people in the Lamont administration, there's a very good mix of folks that have business or private sector background, and then a lot of folks that have government background as well. And it's my view, based on what I've seen in 9 months, that you need both, because you need folks to understand how to get stuff done in Hartford. But I also think it's important that there is that private sector perspective. How can we do this better? How can we do this more efficiently? And obviously, the public sector is asking that all the time too. But to have different perspectives, that diversity, I think that's really important to make sure that we provide the most efficient government at the least cost for our taxpayers. So, very, very key to the Lamont administration. And I think you're going to continue to see more of that. I was yesterday, as an example, I was at the first Governor's Workforce Council meeting. So that's a 24-member council. In addition, there's some ex officio members as well. But 13 of those 24 members are CEOs or presidents of Connecticut businesses. And that is a council that's going to be led by the private sector, informing government, informing higher ed, not-for-profits, et cetera, what they need. And obviously it's going to be a dialogue. Higher ed and not-for-profits are going to talk about their priorities as well. But making sure that we get everyone around the same table talking, you're going to see that a lot from the Lamont administration. And I think that's a way for us to really succeed.
I 100% agree. Listen, whenever you say public-private partnership, but the private sector doesn't have a good representation in decision-making, that's not really a partnership. Yeah. So seeing that, that over half actually of that group are in the private sector, I think is very, very encouraging. And those of us that spend our time in the private sector, and, you came from there, as I mentioned before, I think we understand that everything that we have, employment, population, the funding for the government, all comes from a healthy private sector. So it's exciting to see you guys focusing on that.
Yeah, that's important. And now the other thing with the private sector that you'll see, and we can move off this if you like, Ari, but the ability to leverage private sector dollars is really important because, as you mentioned, the government from a funding perspective, fiscal stability is really important. So where we can get private sector expertise and know-how, in addition to private sector dollars working alongside government dollars on certain broader initiatives, that's great. Obviously, the private sector is going to do what the private sector does, and I'm a big believer in that. But stuff where there can be a public-private partnership and the government can be involved in a meaningful way, those are discussions that we want to have. We'll talk maybe a bit more about the debt diet. Obviously, all of this needs to be done in the context of, where should we borrow? How much should we borrow? Because the state, as you know, has borrowed a lot of money in the past, and, we need to have more economic growth. We need to be really smart about our borrowing.
So let's actually go right from there and talk about your strategy. I mean, I think if we're going to be successful, right, we need to have a strategy. Doing a million things in a million different directions is unlikely to have lasting results. So what is your strategy to kind of move the needle?
Well, that's a pretty broad question. Yeah. Let me try to narrow it down. So
sure.
my view is there's 3, maybe 4 kind of macro pillars in terms of long-term growth. And then we can talk about, business recruitment, tourism, various things like that. But long-term, I think if you look at successful economies, you have great transportation, getting people around goods and services quickly, really, really important. Tremendous talent and workforce and education. I would say that's all linked. That's kindergarten through vocational or graduate schools. Fiscal stability, or what I call long-term tax certainty, is really important. If we're going to talk to a family about moving here or someone to build a factory here, they want to make sure they understand what's that tax burden going to be over the next 20, 30, 40 years. And then lastly, cities. I have a very strong opinion that the next 25 or 50 years of the state, we need to have a greater investment in our cities and, how densely populated they are, kind of the IP, the livability that comes out of them. Cities are economic growth engines, and you can't just manufacture this. It's going to happen tomorrow. It's going to take time for us because the cities in Connecticut are generally smaller. Metro areas are big enough, but the cities are generally smaller. In certain cities, there's this what I would call a commuter mentality, or historically there has been, where people have been there from 9 to 5, and then they'd go out. So if you take, Hartford is an example of that. So I think we need more people living in downtown Hartford, working in downtown Hartford, spending money there, et cetera. And I think once you get to a critical mass, that these cities take a life of their own, and I think they become real economic growth engines for the state. So those are the 4 pillars. Then we can dive deeper into business recruitment and all that stuff, but those are all really important from a macro perspective.
Right. And on those 4 pillars, right? Transportation, workforce, fiscal stability, and cities. I think, fair-minded people, well, listen, I'll just speak for myself, have to agree that those things make a whole lot of sense. And if you see when people leave Connecticut, our biggest out-migration destinations is not Southern or mid-Atlantic, really. It's Boston and New York, right? It's those cities where there's that life and that urban vibe. So I think it's hard to argue that. What's DECD's role in moving forward on those 4 pillars?
Well, I think there's a couple. Well, let's take the cities first. So I think there's a couple things that we do as it relates to urban strategy. First and foremost, brownfield dollars. I'm not sure if you're familiar with the Brownfields program, but that's something we oversee at DECD. Typically, there's been roughly $20 million a year in the past, and these are actually important dollars from my perspective. That we should be bonding to help remediate and clean up sites, because some of these sites are old factories, old buildings. There's contamination, and there's lots of studies in terms of blight or a building in a neighborhood. The whole neighborhood really can't reach its potential if you have buildings. So making sure that we're utilizing brownfields dollars is very, very important. Opportunity zones. So we passed some opportunity zone legislation. There's 72 of them in the state. We passed some legislation in May. We did a conference in New Haven 3 weeks ago. We had over 400 people there, making sure that we're attracting investment in our opportunity zones, 95% of which are cities. And that's not just real estate investment, that's business investment. So one of the things we're also contemplating is incentives for smart job creation, performance-based incentives, what I call earn as you grow. Really incentivizing businesses when they're growing or thinking of coming to Connecticut to locate in our cities and locate in our opportunity zones. So those are three examples where we're trying to have more high-paying jobs, more investment, cleaning up the remediation of some of these sites where there is contamination. We really need to focus, I think, our resources from the government's perspective, and obviously we want the private sector to do a lot of the lifting here. They should be doing lifting, but the more we can concentrate that, I think, the better.
Provide the environment where they can invest. So talk a little bit about the earn as you grow, and that's something that you've talked about a bunch, and anyone that kind of Googles you will find that link to your name. So maybe explain kind of what that is a little bit.
Yeah. So
and maybe in the contrast to what we've done in the past.
Yeah. So we live in a world where it's a very competitive environment for attracting businesses. So incentives, whether you like them or don't like them, they're out there, and that's the market.
Unilateral disarmament on incentives is not going to go well.
It's not. But listen, I would say this though: when you look at, and I've spent a lot of time looking at the academic research on this, if you look over long periods of time, the incentive is not one of the four pillars in terms of economic growth, right? It's education, it's transportation, it's tax certainty. That really matters for long-term growth. You need to have incentives, but incentives, that's not the key to growing the economy, in my opinion. So, but we need to have something that's competitive in the market. What we previously did is we would provide loans, by and large. Sometimes they were grants, but loans that often had loan forgiveness. And we would effectively be an investor in a company by providing some amount of dollars. Typically, there were lots of private dollars that maybe came in alongside of it. But that we were all of a sudden an investor in the company, we the state, when we were incentivizing job creation or furthering a project. The big difference is we're focused on what I call performance-based or earn as you grow, which is the burden is on the company or the private sector to put up the dollars to create the jobs. And then there can be a rebate or a reduction in some of their tax burden in the future, but the burden is on them to create the jobs first, to make the investment first before they can qualify for that incentive. And what that does is it does two things. One, they need, because there are times when a company will say, well, we can create these jobs, and then bad things happen to even good businesses. They don't do it, or the business comes across tough times. Then all of a sudden, the state's in the capital structure, and that's not what we do. We're not investors in that type of way, right? There are lots of banks and other funds that do this type of investing. So we're focused more on rebate type concepts that are earned over the period of 5 or even 10 years, tax credits for urban reinvestment that are earned over 5 or 10 years. There's a sales and use tax exemption for significant capital investment alongside job creation. So all of these, importantly, is not going to be the government coming out of pocket day one, but some of that benefit will be either shared in the future or it'll reduce the tax cost for the private investor day one.
And do you think that businesses are going to be receptive to that? And how competitive is that, earn as you go mentality to what other states are doing?
It's competitive. Many states have, and it's very tough to generalize here, Ari, but most states have a performance-based concept. Like if you look, for example, at what happened with Amazon's HQ2, which was very, very visible, those were performance-based incentives. Amazon is funding a lot of what they need to do for their HQ2 in Northern Virginia, and then there's lots of incentives for job creation, transit, around education that the government's providing, but it's all contingent upon Amazon's investment in Amazon's job creation. The other thing I would say when I think about this needs to be competitive, and if it's not, right, I'm a pragmatist at the end of the day. Right. This is not. I don't have. This is not a religion, if you will. But I do put myself a lot in the private sector shoes. How would they think about this? And my perspective is. A lot of folks, you need a competitive incentive, but does it need to be the very best price in the market or the best incentive? I don't think so. And if ultimately my antenna candidly goes up if a business is saying, well, you need to get to this level per job, or you need to come out with this amount of dollars, I start to get a little concerned. Do they really want to be in Connecticut, or are they really just looking for the dollars? Because in my mind, people should want to be in Connecticut because of our education, because of our healthcare, because of our quality of life, the natural beauty we have. I mean, we can go through the strengths we have in the state, but incentives should be part of that. They shouldn't be the factor. They should be a factor. And candidly, they should be a small factor if we're doing our job right.
Yeah, sort of tipping the balance at the end if we're doing the right stuff on transportation, on workforce, on fiscal stability, and having dynamic cities. Your philosophy, it sounds like to me, not to put words in your mouth, David, but to summarize, I think what you said is if we have those four pillars working, the incentives might be a little bit of help, but it's not going to be the deciding factor.
That's right. And if you take it to its even logical extreme, a world, because every incentive is sorry if we're getting deeper than we wanted in this, sorry, but every incentive is a payment from one group of taxpayers to another. And anytime you're doing that, you need to be really, really careful. So in my mind, in my example before, if the payment over time for a job is $7,000 and another state's offering up $10,000, okay, is that $3,000 delta or difference per job? Is that really gonna? If that's making the difference, we're not doing the rest of our job right. That's what I keep coming back to.
I agree,
because I think the typical CEO, that's again, it's part of it. They oftentimes do need to check the box that the states playing ball are working with them, and I think we want to make sure we're doing that. But I think if we need to be the best price to be winning certain of these deals, quote unquote, then we need to change our strategy.
Yeah, I'm definitely agreeing with that. So this is a manufacturing focused podcast, so I want to turn a little bit to that.
Yeah, please.
Manufacturing's been growing jobs in Connecticut. October was the second fastest growing sector, something we haven't seen in a long time. And there's a lot of growth on the horizon. So what's been your engagement? And you don't come from that background, obviously. Real estate, like you mentioned, financial services, whatever. What are you doing to kind of get yourself trained up, as it were, to understand what manufacturers need and what they can bring to Connecticut?
Yeah, so it's a great question. So I don't have a manufacturing background, but I have had significant interaction, education on manufacturing. I visited a ton of companies from, the Pratts and Electric Boats of the world to manufacturers of 10 or 20 people in Bristol and beyond. So I've had a chance to really sit with a lot of manufacturers. I think I have a broad understanding, I would say, of the constraints as it relates to talent, to their margins, to everything from electricity costs to labor costs. So there's a lot of factors that go in. As I think you're aware, we recently hired Colin Cooper, who is a 25-year plus manufacturing veteran in the aerospace industry. He's serving as the state's first chief manufacturing officer. So he sits literally 10 feet away from me in the office. He's working across agencies, but he's out there and he's going to be the one that's going to be advising the governor, myself and others on here's what we need to be doing. Here are the first priorities. Here's where we need to borrow money here in terms of helping the industry as it relates to talent potentially, if there are incentives needed for capital investment that we don't have to be competitive. So I'm going to rely a lot on Colin as it relates to the nitty gritty. He's an expert, and that's kind of the Lamont.
And he's not afraid to talk to you, right? He'll tell you what you want and what you need to know, whether you want to know it or not.
Absolutely. And him and I have a great relationship, and his experience I think is going to be really important. But having a practitioner, what I heard from the manufacturing industry when I started spending a lot of time is they don't want the government to think they know what's right. They want someone who actually managed these businesses through economic cycles, through business cycles, to be that person. And Colin is doing that. So I definitely know what I don't know, and I know what I know. With manufacturing, I understand the significant multiplier effect in terms of indirect jobs and induced jobs, the comparative advantage we have. You and I were talking previously about location quotient. We have a real density of aerospace and defense manufacturing in particular. And when I think about kind of high value manufacturing, right, that is something where we have a comparative advantage, and that works for Connecticut's cost system, if you will, right? We commoditized manufacturing where we're competing with a China, for example. Well, I'm not sure there's an edge for Connecticut given labor costs, electricity costs, some of the other stuff I mentioned. So we can talk more about it.
Yeah, actually, well, before we do, you did bring it up, location quotient. And so, at the risk of us turning into two data nerds here, let's just quickly kind of talk about, because it was something I really didn't know anything about. I heard you speak about it the other day.
Yep.
And I thought it was really interesting. And so just kind of give us a quick primer on what is location quotient and where do we have it in spades and where don't we?
It's not a word I typically use with my kids on weekends. But, so location quotient is the density of whether it's employees or institutions in a certain area relative to another area. Typically, in the example I gave the other day, it's relative to the United States as a whole. So specifically, the location quotient for aerospace and defense in Connecticut is approximately 5. Now, what that means is you have 5 times the density of aerospace and defense workers.
So if you're a
here in
1,
Connecticut.
if you're 1, you're average.
Correct.
If you're 5, you're 5x the average.
That's right.
So, which seems pretty high to me.
I was gonna say, and from when I hear that is very high. It's the highest, I believe, in any tradable industry in the state. So we have 5 times the density of aerospace and defense here in the state of Connecticut relative to the country. That is a comparative advantage. When you think about a Silicon Valley and what makes certain ecosystems work, that is one that we have here. And I think I mentioned the other day too, but if not, the next highest location quotient I think is insurance services, which is right around a 3. So everyone thinks of Hartford, well, this is the insurance capital, or Connecticut's the insurance capital. More people need to be thinking about Connecticut as the aerospace alley, if you will, for the world, and the aerospace capital, because that is a clear advantage we have in manufacturing and something we need to continue to build on.
Yeah, and I think I love that you brought up Silicon Valley, because I think, a lot of people miss the fact that what drives business, certainly it seems to me in 2019, and maybe now as the commissioner of DECD, you could speak on this with much more authority than I can, but it tends to be a lot less driven strictly on cost. I mean, how many articles have been written that if cost was the only factor, then Mississippi would be the fastest growing job creator in the whole country. But you look at places like Boston, Silicon Valley that grow jobs, greatly. They're not the cheapest places to be.
No, it's almost like the incentive conversation. Cost is a factor, and for the PhDs in economics out there, I mean, when you think about supply and demand, I mean, cost matters, and in certain businesses, depending on, operating budget, margins. I mean, it's more. Certain businesses are going to be more cost sensitive than other businesses. But I think it's important to know that, depending on the business and depending on your margin and how you think about the importance of cost, it could be a very significant factor, but it could be a very limiting factor. And especially and I know we're focused on manufacturing here, but more in the service-based economy where there's a different business model, getting the right people, making sure those people are happy, education, transportation, it goes back into that.
Yep.
The quality of life issues, that's really important. And I think, I mentioned this workforce council meeting yesterday, but the availability of our workforce is going to be critical, I think, over the next 5 years to attract businesses here, because we're not going to be able to say, oh, we've got great education and healthcare, but we need to import all of these computer scientists. Like that's stuff that we need to be addressing.
Well, I think what's really exciting, and maybe this will be an opportunity for me to kind of open your mind a little bit on this too, but I think one of the things about manufacturing that people I don't think understand is how high tech and high skilled it is today. And when you look at and you go to manufacturing plants, and I go to them all the time. We have a number of clients, plus because of what I do, I'm at a lot of places, and you go there now, and I've really latched onto this lean, green, and clean, because that's really where it is, and it's really high tech. So when you look at I was just happened to be at Polymer Precision yesterday, which is a huge manufacturer in New Britain and Newington. Yeah. And when you go in the back there and you look at what they're doing, what they're looking for is really like high level engineers and software engineers, because you've got these huge automated machines that run this stuff. And so, the ability, and of course, cybersecurity is a big concern there. So, it's really that high skill workforce isn't just for the other industries. Manufacturing needs it. And even whether it's the machinists and all that stuff, I mean, manufacturing is one of those industries now that is looking for that high skilled labor.
Yeah, listen, my view, and I've heard this a lot from my visits with manufacturers as well, and I haven't been to Polymer yet, but I've met with others in New Britain. This trend towards more automation to basically more capital intensive manufacturing, the studies have shown that's going to create the need for potentially even more jobs. Forget about, it's certainly a change in the jobs, but the fact that they're going to be higher skilled jobs, potentially, or likely higher paying jobs, that really is critical. And we need to do a better job educating folks that this is a real career, to your point. I think the governor said it yesterday or 2 days ago, rather, at the ACM conference, the lean, clean, and green. And I think he said green times 2. It's, green, and that these are really great paying jobs. And these are really, they're careers, not jobs. So I think getting that message out more and more, alongside the fact where we have this real critical advantage, I think that's going to be really important for the manufacturing sector here.
No question about it. And to be competitive globally, Connecticut needs to be really doubling down or tripling down even on, what's called Industry 4.0. And I'm sure you've met with, Marty Guay and what they've got with the Stanley Black & Decker downtown Hartford and what they're doing there. And they're just, they're being such good corporate citizens, not only kind of showcasing what we're doing for manufacturing here in Connecticut and putting something downtown in the capital city to help build that momentum and kind of latch on to that, which I think you alluded to. they're also, and you may know this as well, but they're also being out there in the community helping other people see what's possible. So we had a client of ours kind of say, hey, listen, we're really trying to dip our toe into 4.0 more, but we'd love to see it in progress. Where can we kind of see it and touch it to kind of accelerate our investment? And I was like, listen, I'm gonna hook you up with Marty. Said, talk to Marty. He's like, let's make it happen. Send an email, bing, bang, boom. And now you've got, two different manufacturers that really kind of working together to help grow the Connecticut economy. And I think it's really important for the government to understand that that's happening and help support that.
Yeah, no, I joke sometimes. I think I see Marty Guay more than I see my wife, actually. So he's truly ubiquitous. And what Marty and Jim Laree and Stanley are doing, they've really taken a very visible leadership role for manufacturing. And I've been to the manufacturer, I think 3 or 4 times now. They host meetings there. It's great, and the more we can get that word out there and market it, the better.
Yeah, that's really fantastic. So what do you see as your role now that Colin's on board? Do you see your role with manufacturing advocacy kind of diminishing?
No, so no is the short answer. I do think I'm a big believer in specialization, and again, as I said before, Ari, I know what I know and know what I don't know. So I think Colin is another leverage point for the government, where him and I are going to go to certain meetings. We were both at the ACM. We both spoke at the ACM. We're doing a lot of stuff together, but there's only a certain amount of hours in the day. So Colin, for example, today I think is at a site visit that I'm not able to attend. Sure. So I think it really underscores the importance of manufacturing to the Lamont administration and to how we think about our economic growth. Manufacturing, we're doing this economic development strategy right now. I forgot if I mentioned this to you, Ari, but we're going to really focus on 3 or 4, maybe 5 core industries, and manufacturing is absolutely going to be one of those industries. So I'm focused. I want to utilize Colin. I just feel he's someone that can have extra focus, if you will. But the amount of time I'm focused on manufacturing is the same now with Colin on board. He's just providing even that much more.
That's fantastic. When do you think you're going to release kind of what those 3 or 4 or 5? And let's try not keep adding, because 3 or 4 or 5 could turn into 6, 7, 8, 9, 10.
No, it won't. Listen, I'm a big believer. So, let me answer your first question first. It'll be January, February, I think, is when we're going to do probably a roadshow of sorts in terms of the economic development strategy, and that's going to be broad based. That's not just jobs and industries, but we're going to focus on placemaking, urban, et cetera. So it's going to be really action oriented. So I'm very enthusiastic about this, and there'll be a workforce component as well. But we to your point, we need to be focused. So I think it's going to be within that 3 to 5, especially from a core industry perspective. But manufacturing will absolutely be there.
So let me ask you a couple things, and I'm going to maybe bounce around a little bit here. But
sure.
I think I'm going to start with this component, which is there's clearly some ginormous manufacturers in the state of Connecticut. You mentioned Pratt, you mentioned Electric Boat. I think Sikorsky, probably fits into that kind of,
sure.
Ultra large. Certainly Northrop Grumman itself is enormous. But there's, then there's also a lot of small manufacturers, and sometimes the needs and desires don't always align. I don't know if you've seen that or not, and how do you kind of thread that needle?
It's a great question. No, it's not lost on me, and I think about this a lot. So you have roughly 160,000 people in the labor force in manufacturing across 4,000 firms. So that is an average of 40
right.
in terms of number of people at an average manufacturer. The reality, to your point, if you look at that distribution, the median is likely 20 or 25 because the big 3 you just mentioned are really throwing off that average or skewing the average. Yeah. So I think we need to be really attentive to small to mid-sized manufacturers. The reality is a lot of the job growth in this state and in this country is in smaller businesses, newer businesses. So we need to be attentive to them. And I think we are in many ways. So there's the Manufacturing Innovation Fund. There's representation from small to mid-sized manufacturers. Colin's spending a lot of his time there as well. I do myself. So I think it's making sure that we have our ear to the ground on the needs of small manufacturers. I've certainly heard about, the bigger manufacturers, the OEMs, hiring their people, and again, some of this you could argue is these are high quality problems, but high quality problems that we need to address.
No, understood.
I want to be clear about that, but making sure that we're talking about ways where we can pool resources to recruit, upskill, to train, apprenticeships. So I think it's definitely not lost on me, and I know it's not lost on Colin and the whole administration. The median manufacturer is not EB, right? They're,
Right.
they're 20, 25 people. And, those are businesses that have tight margins, and we need to be really sensitive to that.
Yeah, and it's a unique situation, right? Because I think just talking about what you meant about the location quotient, part of that location quotient started with the fact that a lot of these big OEMs are here, right? The reason why we're number one in sub building is because EB builds subs here.
Correct.
So the supplier base, and so it's an interesting dichotomy, right? Because where their needs, there's a lot of places where their needs converge, and there's places where their needs diverge.
Yes.
And so let me kind of turn this question into maybe an offer of help that hopefully people will hear, which is, what can kind of the small and mid-sized manufacturers do to help you and help the Lamont administration in general execute better in ways that will help the entire ecosystem grow?
Yeah. So I appreciate that question, because one of the things Colin's really tasked with right now, and I talked a bit about it at the ACM, is, what are the right programs, right? We've borrowed a lot of money as a state, and we talked about the debt diet, but what should the state be doing to be helpful as it relates to apprenticeships or incumbent worker training? What are the most effective programs? We need to make sure that the return works for taxpayers and more broadly, but we want to make sure that we're getting that feedback, and Colin's really running point on that. So understanding, what we're not doing that we need to be doing, or certainly if we're doing something that we shouldn't be doing, Colin's running point on that, and ultimately that's going to be part of this economic development strategy. So Colin, I think only part tongue in cheek says, his top three priorities are workforce, and workforce. But whether it's related to workforce or beyond that, making sure that we're getting that feedback. And there's great organizations like CMC and regional manufacturing organizations too. Let's get that information to Colin or to myself, and we'll act on it. I mean, we want to make sure that we're getting that feedback.
So engagement really, you think, is kind of the number one thing they can do to help?
That is absolutely, as it relates to the government. The second thing, or tied for first, if you will, is, given workforce are the top three priorities as we see it right now, making sure that all these manufacturers, not just the big ones, but the small, the medium-sized ones, that they're going to their local middle school or their high school, that they're reaching out, that this education about it being a career, that it's clean and it's well-paying. Like, we need to do a better job on that, and that can't just be done it shouldn't just be done, candidly, by the Lamont administration. It needs to be done by the industry. So I think the more we can have the 4,000 firms that are in the state that do manufacturing get out and educate folks, because that's going to help them get the workforce that they need to be successful.
Yeah, absolutely. That's I think that's extremely well said. I want to pull on the debt diet thread, because we didn't talk about it too much, but there's some kind of rumblings or some nervousness about what's going to get cut. I think conceptually we all agree that the state needs to go on a debt diet, right? So of course everyone can agree on that, but then when it's their part of the meal that gets dieted out, that becomes a problem. So investing in and look, I get it. I can imagine being in your shoes is tough. It can be tough. The manufacturers are wondering what is going to happen to the investment, particularly in reimbursements for incumbent worker training, assistance in new worker training. There's a lot that needs to be done there, and this is an area where we feel like, speaking from a manufacturer base, that the partnerships worked out well, right? The government's helped with some, and we've helped with some and made jobs. Does that continue?
So it's a great question. And I think the Manufacturing Innovation Fund, which had $75 million of funding, and we're coming towards the end of that.
May of this coming year?
I think I forget. There's a fixed dollar amount. I thought we're down to the last. It's less than $5 million, I believe. And there's a board that basically needs to allocate that. So, but I think, and Colin is working on this. And again, he's going to run point on this because he's closest to it. He's going to have the best sense of what's effective. But the question is, what should the 2.0 version of that be? How should we structure it? What should be the dollar amount? Should it be focused differently? Should the governance be differently? I think in the context of the debt diet, we should still be doing smart borrowing. And I define that as, there needs to be a discernible return, especially if you're not funding a capital project. But let's show that if we borrow this money, even if it's a matching or public-private partnership, let's figure out how this works for taxpayers as well as manufacturers. So that really is the burden that is important. I would just point out, though, Ari, there still is $30 million in bonding dollars available at the Department of Labor for apprenticeships. There were, I think, $10 million was bonded in August, if I'm not mistaken. That's working through the WIBs, I believe. But there are still some dollars out there. I realize those are different than the Manufacturing Innovation Fund. But the message you should be hearing from me is, I think we want to be smart on our borrowing. So if there are ideas on what that should look like, definitely send it my way, to Colin's way. We're working on that, but it needs to pass that balance of, does it work? What would a reasonable taxpayer say about that borrowing?
And so if one of these, if a manufacturing group or a group of company wants to make the case that the investment is worthwhile, what does that case look like? How do they go about making that case?
Listen, I think in my mind, it comes down to it's an ROI analysis, a return on investment analysis. So that if the state puts out $1, what is the state getting back that it otherwise would not have gotten back? And that's kind of important because I think at times there's a philosophy that the assumption is, it wouldn't have happened. Reality is a lot of times what I've seen, and this is not related to manufacturing, but broadly, if the state doesn't do something, well, it still sometimes gets done. It just gets done with private dollars. But I think the key is if some type of handicap of what would have happened or wouldn't have happened if the state didn't do it, and then how we should think about the return on revenues to the state through whether it's sales tax, obviously job creation we care deeply about, and income tax that comes off of that. So that's kind of the rough framework, is kind of a broad ROI analysis. But the other thing I would say is we should be playing the long game here. This is not, that money comes back next month or next year necessarily. We want to make smart investments for the next 25 years. And I realize that's a very long time period, but we need to be thinking long game on this.
So a couple quick questions, just to follow up on that. Number one is I think there's a lot of really interesting things happening, not just in aerospace, and that was obviously hugely talked about, but also in medical device manufacturing and plastics and in other things. And one of the big challenge that I'm hearing from manufacturers in Connecticut and what we see is the demand for these parts is here, it's real, and it's now. And if we don't skill up the workforce quickly to have that work come here, it's just going to go somewhere else. Yep. And once it's somewhere else, it's hard to get back. So anyway, that was a quick little pitch why I think it's important.
No, I agree, and that's what there's a sense of urgency. So if folks, we got Colin on board, the Workforce Council, which is new, and I think will have a real impact. We're doing everything. We can talk more about the initiatives that are out there, but we're very focused. And if there's new ideas or if folks feel like things aren't happening quick enough, they should let me know. But typically they have been.
Yeah. One thing in Connecticut, people probably aren't too shy to tell you stuff when they see I wouldn't.
No, but I definitely appreciate what's at risk, and we need to maintain and again build on this advantage that we have in certain sectors because it's critical, especially as transportation costs for certain parts continues to increase. We continue to really press this comparative advantage is important.
I think what you said about the 4 pillars is really interesting, and I like that. But I sort of have the sense, not that I know you that well, but I sort of have the sense, based on your background, a couple of things we've talked about, that you're a bit of a numbers guy, a bit of a KPI metrics guy,
allegedly.
So I'm curious. When you look at trying to achieve the state's goals, I don't know if you've set for yourself any specific metrics or targets you'd like to hit. Well, I'll start with that, and I got to follow up.
Well, so we're working on it. And that's part of this. I have it. Is this kind of the fully endorsed plan from the administration? It's not yet, but I'll talk from my perspective on what I think we need to see, and I think we'll try to better codify this. But what I think we need to focus on is what I call inclusive economic growth. So call it median income growth, or the amount of folks that are the percentage of folks in the state of Connecticut that are earning a living wage. I think that's really, really important. Obviously, so income growth is important. Job growth is really important. And listen, there's a job growth and population growth. We're in a very tight labor market now, not just in the state of Connecticut, but broadly. But I do think when you think about what grows the economy, you either need more people here doing stuff or the same amount of people doing a lot more productive stuff. Right. Ideally, you need both.
Yeah, ideally,
so
right.
I think what we want to have is, we want the income growth, we want the job and the population growth. Again, in the Northeast, I think population growth or above trend population growth is going to be hard. But the income growth and kind of the higher productivity jobs, I think it's really important that we do that because those are jobs that can survive and thrive within our cost system. And then the last metric I would say is GDP, which is imperfect at the state level. But I think it's important. You need some measure of output. How are we doing in terms of output broadly, and then output per capita? How productive is our workforce vis-a-vis our peers?
Yeah, which, by the way, I think on a regular basis, GDP per capita is pretty high in Connecticut.
We actually have the highest. So GDP per capita is highest. And again, there's some reasons for that, but yeah, that's something that and the overall, the median incomes we have here is top decile too. So there's certain things that we should be proud of.
Which makes them hard to grow. So on that level, when you guys do have those kind of KPIs and those metrics, I guess I'm curious, have you thought about leading indicators? Because, I think it's one thing to say, hey, this is what we want to get to, but if all we think about is the end, but we don't know when the successful steps we have to take to get there often don't get there. So have you thought about those leading indicators and what those might look like?
Yeah. So yes, I have. And leading indicators we can get, I'm not sure if you're degrees in economics. I'm starting to think it might be. But yes, and I don't know if you ever read the Connecticut Economic Digest. It comes out monthly from DOL and DECD. But things like average hours worked, manufacturing, housing permits that are being put out there. Those are two, but I probably focus more on coincident or real-time indicators as well. But I think, that's why I think when sometimes these monthly job reports come out, that is at best, I think, a current indicator and arguably lagging at times. So I think we need to focus on things like hours worked, wage increases, because I do think that's a good, at least current indicator, meaning how much pressure is there on incomes going up as it relates to productivity, and then anything related to building starts I think is good. So whether it's residential housing or other construction here in the state, I think that's probably a pretty good current indicator.
This is kind of off topic, but it's my show, so I get to ask some personal questions. Why do you think that is? And I, by the way, do not have a degree in economics. I have not even a full degree in political science, but.
So why do I think? Why do I think?
Yeah, why is construction important? Like, why do you see that as a leading indicator?
Well, again, I think it's probably more current. If I had to guess, but I think it shows you real time. To construct something, to build something, you need to believe that there's either forward demand if it's on a spec basis, certainly if it's residential. So that shows confidence in the future, because typically when you're constructing something, you're not necessarily selling it for 12 or getting a tenant for 12 or 24, even 36 months. So I think it shows confidence in the economy, and it shows that people are willing to put their own capital at risk to actually build things, because there's not a lot of liquidity in that area, and it's a long-term vote of confidence.
Oh, that's pretty exciting. So talk a bit about the opportunity zones. And let me kind of frame it in this way. Yep. And again, just want to really focus on manufacturing a little bit. I love the concept of the cities personally. I think there's a lot right there.
Sure.
What I wonder, though, is given kind of the way the state's sort of laid out and the property tax burdens that happen inside of cities can make it really difficult for manufacturers to succeed there. So how do we kind of do both, right? How do we focus on growing manufacturing and growing our cities at the same time?
So you're bringing up a good point, which is the tax burden in certain areas, because you don't have the depth of the grand lists relative to the current expenses and services provided, is that can be that can dissuade folks from making that investment. So obviously there's the state has an enterprise zone program. I'm not sure if you're familiar with that, which is a 5-year abatement where you pay 20% of the property tax. The state kicks in 40 and the municipality forgoes 40. So that program's out there. It's being utilized. In addition, municipalities have the ability to negotiate their own bespoke abatements. Now, some are willing to do that, some are not. And listen, there's a real question here. Like any incentive question, how do you make sure you get the investment? And importantly, by the way, you want to make sure that you're getting tax revenue that more than offsets the new services or the infrastructure build, right? Because I find it sometimes there's this focus on marginal revenue, but there's a marginal expense associated with that. You want to make sure that there's a marginal profit or EBITDA profit, if you want to think about it like that. But I think, so those are two, enterprise zone program, the ability to negotiate other abatements. But ultimately, we need to figure out ways the only way to lower these mill rates is to responsibly grow these grand lists, in my opinion. And obviously you need to watch spending on the expense side of things as well. But I think growth is going to be important. And I think ultimately the market's going to dictate, where the manufacturers want to be. And it's going to need to be, per my tax certainty, it's going to need to be an environment they feel comfortable is going to provide them the certainty they need for their business.
I think that's really, really fantastic. And we're going to kind of get to the end and wrap it up, but I want to ask you kind of a forward-looking question. And by the way, I don't know if you know about our rapid fire round of questions.
I don't, but I'm about to learn.
Under fire. So just, I'm curious your perspective on just the general outlook, your level of confidence in the ability to succeed at the goals we're talking about.
Listen, I'm confident. I'm enthusiastic. I mean, this job has been amazing. I'm only 9 months in, but I'm very confident. And you were talking about economic indicators before. The recent economic data is better. It's certainly not where we need to be. We'll see where there's a big lag on Q3 GDP, for example. It comes out in January. But I'm confident that the state looks more attractive and is very attractive. Listen, part of this is a silver lining in some of the underperformance we've had. Median home prices really have not grown here. But when you see incomes relative to home prices, are we the most attractive on that metric? No, but we look very reasonable. Mm-hmm. So I guess the point I'm making is I think the economic data is better than it has been. We still have a lot of room to improve. I think the governor's focus on fiscal stability and giving businesses confidence in being here, what we're going to do as it relates to transportation, as well as getting them the workers they need to be, that's a message that we need to keep being very clear on, and the city's message. So I'm enthusiastic. I think the recent data suggests some enthusiasm as well, but this is going to take some time, but we're going to do it.
I love it. I love the enthusiasm. I love the commitment, and just wanted to, before we go to lightning round, just wanted to thank you for kind of coming on and engaging, as we talked about kind of earlier, and relative to your note. I think perception is something that needs to change for us to be successful.
Yep.
And it's the easiest thing to change if you just put in the effort. So it's awesome to see you putting in the effort, David. And I super appreciate
that. And I appreciate you having me here.
All right,
now,
man.
In the lightning round, is it going to be like coffee or tea, chocolate or vanilla?
It is kind of like that.
Else?
Yeah. It is kind of like that.
Hit me with it.
All right, here we go. So we'll see. We're testing out some of your political speed chops here. Red Sox or Yankees?
Oh, Yankees.
Oh, David, I liked you so much before.
I see the wall here. That's not even a close one. Give me a tough one.
Starbucks or Dunkin'?
Starbucks.
When you take time off, you staycation or exotic destination guy?
Neither. No. So typically not a staycation, but typically not exotic. We typically stay on the Eastern Seaboard and typically stay within the U.S.
There you go. iPhone or Android?
iPhone.
You do sports car or SUV?
I have a Jeep Wrangler.
There you go. If you could do anything, David, other than what you're doing now, Commissioner of DECD, what's your kind of dream gig?
Honestly, I don't have one is the short answer, and maybe that's a function of just how focused I am on the current job. I don't spend a lot of time thinking about dream gig. I just want to do what I'm doing.
There you go. Do you have a favorite business book?
It's probably When Genius Failed. I'm not sure, and that's more of a financial book than a business book. But I think it's a history of long-term capital management and what happened in 1998 with Russia and the financial crisis at that point in time.
Interesting. What's one thing you learned early in your life, or earlier in your career, that you think propelled you to the success that you had, really at Goldman and to where you are today?
I think it's an appreciation for hard work. I still remember working as a diner and a summer camp counselor, and I was in high school. Really appreciating how important it is to work hard and get stuff done. Right? You need, everything requires hard work. Nothing good, in my opinion, happens without hard work. So I learned that at an early age from my parents and from my environment, and I think hopefully I still am doing that every day.
Yeah, that's great. One of the quotes I've had on the bottom of my email for years is the harder you work, the luckier you get.
By the way, exactly right. Someone told me you got to make your own luck, and you only do that through hard work. But the people that are the luckiest are the ones that also work the hardest.
Hustle. And then our last rapid fire question is, what's one thing you learned later in your career, later in your life, that you wish you'd go back and tell young David that you wish you'd listened to?
For me, it's a marathon, not a sprint. I have a propensity, my wife would say if she was here, that to be a workaholic at times and to get really focused. So I think just understanding that it's a marathon. This is whether it's this job or any other job or live family, that make sure that you take time to appreciate the present. We have 2 young kids, as I mentioned, so I'm very focused on the long term.
That's awesome. Well, I'm going to leave it there. If people wanted to reach out to you, give you some feedback or whatever, what's the best way for them to reach you?
Yeah, probably the best is my email is david.lehman, Lehman, @ct.gov. And I'm very responsive to my email.
That sounds great. So we'll have David's information, his email, in the podcast notes or the YouTube notes, so you can find it and link to him there. And the final question, David, is we've talked about a lot of
the second final question.
Yeah.
All right, keep going.
It's my show. I get to have as many
That's
final
right.
questions as I want. Given everything that we've talked about today, there's been a lot. And one of the goals kind of the podcast is for people to have strong takeaways. So I'd like to ask people at the end, of all the stuff we went around, if someone was to just kind of take one of the nuggets that you talked about today as their main takeaway, what do you think would be one of those great nuggets to talk about?
Well, I think the biggest takeaway you guys should have is the Lehman administration is incredibly focused on business, including manufacturing. We're really focused on the business environment and helping the state grow. And we've got the right focus to do that and the right people that are doing that.
Wow, that's really fantastic. And so, from my perspective, David, I usually pick a topic that we've talked about, but I think for me, the biggest takeaway is like your dynamism, your commitment to kind of making it happen, the energy you bring, the knowledge you bring to the job. I think it's inspiring me to have some faith in government.
I guess thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. And I really appreciate that. And I look forward to watching you grow and develop over the coming years and helping continue to grow the Connecticut economy.
Well, thanks again for having me here, Ari. I appreciate it.
All right, David.
I don't know if we're supposed to.
That's right. We can.
See you.
Made in America with Ari Santiago is brought to you by IT Direct.
As always, thanks so much for tuning in. I definitely want your feedback and hope you subscribe. But what I want the most is to build a community where we learn and grow with each other. I hope you're getting a lot of value out of the time we're spending together. Thanks so much for listening. I'll see you next time.